Welcome to this event from the CIPR Sports Network. It's the first in a new series of regular Sports Network webinars. Over the coming months, we aim to share and showcase some best practice in the world of sport, look at and learn from challenges and the opportunities that come through individuals and organizations, and show how great communication and ever-evolving delivery can help individuals, organizations and brands. So it should be really good insight for comms professionals of all backgrounds, members, prospective members, those working with sport, within sport, or with an interest in what can be learned from sport. Who better to kick us off? Fresh from a huge stint in Paris this summer is Team GB's Director of Communications and Marketing, Scott Field. And we're going to be talking about the evolving role of communications with Olympic athletes, brands, and audiences. I'm Chris Haynes, Vice Chair of the CIPR Sports Group and the comms consultant. And in my locker are decades of driving comms for Sky Sports from launch, great time supporting Team Sky in the first Tour de France winning days, and 5 years with England cricket, including World Cup wins for women and men. Alongside me is another Scott, Scott Dougal, also Vice Chair of the CIPR Sports Group. He's Director of Communications and Digital at World Sailing, was Head of Communications at British Cycling through that glorious decade from London 2012. And prior to that, he was a journalist and editor with the Press Association. Much more important, in conversation with us is Scott Field. Recovered from his third Summer Games with GB Olympics. He's responsible for communications, marketing, and digital at the BOA right through the Olympic cycles. He too started his career as a broadcast journalist, moved into a range of roles in professional football, including Director of Comms and Marketing at Watford and I believe his beloved West Brom, and then became the highly regarded Head of Team Communications at the Football Association. And in that time at the FA, he led comms for men's and women's football teams at London 2012. So joining the BOA in early 16, he's led communications through Rio, Tokyo, the recent Paris Games, and Winter Games in Pyeongchang and Beijing. So, Scott, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Really appreciate it.
Look, first up, could you simply describe, I suppose, your role and how you see its purpose at the BOA?
Well, firstly, I always start by just explaining a little bit about the BOA because there are often sort of misunderstandings about the role of the organisation. It takes Olympians to the Olympic Games, quite self-evidently. We go to other events through the years, Youth Games, Winter Games, and European events. It's 100% self-funded, so none of the exchequer and lottery money that goes into sport flows into the BOA. That goes to sports governing bodies and then is distributed on to athletes and offers services to them. We're 100% commercially funded in quite a small organisation with about 50 to 60 people in the business at any one time. My role is really responsibility for all outward facing communications, marketing and brand activations. So in speaking to all of our audiences all of the time, I have that responsibility to project the brand narrative. And I think the primary two audiences for us always are our athletes and our fans. And the role, as I very simply see it, is to connect the two as best we can without them seeing much of us in between.
Yeah, I can imagine. And Scott, and you have been involved now, as Chris said, in Olympic sport for 8 years, around 8 years, I think. And you and I first met just after you started at the BOA. But before that, you had a long stint in football, around 15 years. What would you say was the difference between working in football and working in Olympic sport?
There were some quite stark differences actually, Scott, when I first turned up. I think the first really goes to what I was talking about and the shape of the business that the BOA is, because it delivers athletes to the games. It's not a governing body, which is a really key difference. What it means is we're quite planned and thoughtful as we move towards the event. So what I found when I moved to the British Olympic Association was an organisation that took its time to plan long out its major event and its major activation. And by no means is that therefore a criticism of football, but football is working on such a fast cycle of events, a fast news cycle. And so I went from an industry that was at speed, and this is no suggestion that the BOA doesn't, to an organization in particular, and I think a part of the sector where we had much more time to plan, to cogitate, to be thoughtful about what we were trying to do and why we were trying to do it. Football bounces you around because there are so many external factors all of the time, not least because you're in this really quick event cycle, and results obviously dictate your fortunes. So, a win on a Saturday or a loss on a Saturday can impact every bit of work that you're doing throughout the week. Our wins and losses come with, much greater intervals, shall we say? So, we have a lot more time to think about them after the event, but we have a lot more time to build up to them.
I see. Yeah, yeah.
Talk there, Scott, about very fast-moving organisations, and I think in sport it's tempting for people to see sport as incredibly fast-moving and needing to make decisions in the moment. But you've worked in high-performance teams in a national governing body and now the BOA. You just tell us about that balance of planning and readiness.
Look, I don't want to suggest that planning and readiness doesn't happen in sport. I think your point is well made. Clearly, the external influences that buffet football around. As we sit here now, there are multiple stories in the ether that are impacting the game all of the time. I think what you probably have to do in something like football is just protect yourself a little bit more from those forces. Just ensure all the time that you're true to the strategy that you set out to, that you're holding true to the narrative that you will have worked on and pre-agreed the whole time. It's clearly much easier in my world to do that. The downside to that, of course, is you're subject to less interest, right? The big intervals between the games from a sort of PR perspective, can cause for frustration because you're wanting to get a story told where actually other people may view the relevancy of the event or the distance and the proximity of the event as a problem to you. So, there's a clear difference in the way, not just that you plan in those sports, but the way you go about your execution in those sports as well. Clearly, the biggest thing that has changed for all of us over the lifespan of me working in sport is the ability to deliver the message to the audience and our ability to do that firsthand through our own platforms and our own content development. And I think, much of our thought now goes into that. And the whole creative piece that I sit atop of course, is an ecosystem, right? The brand marketing activations are as important as the reactive press office work when we're picking up the phone to help shape a narrative are as important as the creative sessions we have to look at digital content that will sit on our channels or drive our YouTube channel. There's a heck of a lot of thought goes into that, whichever part of the sector you're in. I think there's a real onus in the place that I am now to do much more of that because I can't, you can't drive interest, particularly in legacy media, where I wouldn't say it doesn't exist, but certainly where resources are much more scant than they were, and the outcomes are less guaranteed.
So 3 different continents, 3 very different games, 3 very different backgrounds to those games. If you were to tell me 3 ways in which that role has really changed over that period, what would they be?
I think just playing on the last point is the delivery of content, is just increasing and increasing the whole time. And therefore, the way we shape the team, the demands that we place on the team to be, I think, always the eyes and ears of the team. But actually, that manifests itself in different ways now, because that notion of understanding the team and the athletes that we take should, for me, be translating it into our ability to create coherent messages and content that our audiences want to receive at the right time. So it's less about sort of policing the media, which I think perhaps traditionally, has been a way of managing things in sport, but more about, proactively thinking about turning what we understand about our team, what we know about our team into messages and content that we can produce to serve upon our audiences. I mean, the interesting thing about those three games is the shape of them just being so utterly different. And of course, the one in the middle being the COVID games and a postponed games for the first time in the history of Olympic sport meant that pretty much everything changed in that moment with the one in between. And one of my great learnings coming out of Paris is just remembering what it was like, yeah, to deliver a major event of this scale in normal times. And I say a major event of this scale because it's pretty unique in terms of the numbers, the interest, the global nature of it as compared to anything else I've ever worked in and probably will ever work in.
It felt like, I don't know for you, Scott, but for Tokyo certainly was because of the circumstances. It did feel like that communications came into its own, I think, a little bit with regards to sport, in as much as you were, or communications functions were the glue that brought stakeholders together as well as audiences.
I think that's right, and it's almost counterintuitive to say it, but I almost feel like our athlete communications were never as good as they were during COVID because you really had to think about it the whole time, didn't you? And you couldn't rely on the sort of impromptu and the informal communications that we live through now, right? That we kind of rely on the over the desk stuff or the snatched conversation in a corridor or the water cooler moment, as people term it. Everything was so deliberate, and had to be so deliberate. But it meant we became very structured. We became more communicative in many respects with our audiences because it was our only means of interaction, right? If nothing else. But actually, the communication to athletes became so critical. Critical because, it was existential for many people in every industry, in every walk of life. We were looking at it going, we've never cancelled Olympic Games before, right? It's never happened in this way. Will it happen? How will it happen? All of those questions felt so existential. And so the importance, I think you're right, of communication in that moment was absolutely vital. Every bit of information we got that was telling us that actually it's going to be okay became super critical to sort of pass on to an audience of people who, I suppose, different to a lot of us, are working 4 years, 8 years at a time for a moment in time. Yeah. And, can be career defining, for which it was for a lot of athletes, for some that didn't get to go, sadly, as much as those that did get to go.
Yeah. And I think that idea of communication supporting performance, that really came into its own in Tokyo, I guess, is what we're talking about, really, I think.
I think that's right. And I love the fact that you're talking about communications in performance, because I still think it's such a sort of underviewed area of sport, and something that could be exploited much more. I think the easy one to reflect on is to look at Gareth Southgate's tenure with England and what he did and I saw England close up and personal over a period of years whilst working at the FA. What Gareth was able to do was sort of, think about communications with a different lens, think about the importance to it in respect of how the players went about their business for England. And clearly, he would have wanted to win things at the end of it, but we came as close as we ever did. I say we as an Englishman, to winning. Sorry, Scott. To winning something didn't quite happen, but actually what he did to embolden the team on the field by taking the weight of expectation off them, and also just mending some of those fences that had been broken through nobody's particular fault necessarily over years of mistrust between the media and players, and things that we've now talked very, very openly about. I think that's one side of it, but communications, in the right way, if we can manage it properly, can help set a level of expectation. Clearly, there are mental health benefits that can come with that when you think about an athlete and athlete performance, but also the possibilities of allowing athletes to build their brand, their profile, and their prominence through good comms. And I think, sitting sitting on the side of the fence that I am now, working with some smaller sports, if I can put the word smaller in inverted commas, or sports that traditionally have had less profile, it's such a great opportunity for us to be able to support athletes, to create a persona. That doesn't have to be a huge community of millions of people. It could just be to create really compelling, sort of character narratives and personalities through their own communities as they wish to define them.
So two really interesting points you've just defined there. I think about the role, and sometimes the misunderstood role of communications in sport. The first was about how good communication can help high performance. It doesn't get in the way, it helps high performance. And the second was, it's tempting to see it as very public facing, but you started to explain how your role, which encompasses digital public facing as well, is athletes, partners, commercial partners, stakeholders. There's a wide range of people you started to talk about around Tokyo. Could you just explain a bit more of that remit and how you manage that?
Sure. I mean, just to pick up on your first point as well about how comms can sort of help in the performance environment, I think the start point has to be you want comms not to hinder the performance environment. And I think, I absolutely recognize that noise of any nature can be very, very disruptive to a performance environment. It can be to any workplace. So, minimizing the noise as disruption is such a key facet of what we try and do at the British Olympic Association when we're going into a games, because you want people to be able to focus on what they're trying to do. And I very much see myself as wanting to then also give the oxygen for the good stories to breathe, right? If we can suppress and I don't use the word suppress in the right sense, yeah, but if you can suppress the noise to the extent that you can, and in the right way, and in doing so, credibly and with morals, then that can only be a good thing for the team to be able to go on and execute what they're actually trying to do, right? Which is, win things, do well, progress. I think in terms of the public facing aspect, you're absolutely right. I mean, perhaps my biggest lesson in sport as I went through the echelons, I'd sort of spent 9 years at clubs, and I was quite young and cocksure. And you get, I got to the FA thinking, I know football really well. There's not much anyone can tell me about football. What I realized was I didn't know politics, and I didn't know bureaucracy, and I didn't know the stakeholder environment to the extent I needed to, and that learning, you walk into I remember walking into the FA thinking, oh, well, this is it. This is the FA, right? These are the people that will make the decisions that sort of shape and manage the fabric of the game on a day-to-day environment. And what we say goes, and it was anything but, to be honest with you, because what you had to learn very quickly was that, yeah, that's true to an extent, but it's only successful to the extent that you're bringing everyone with you. You're bringing everyone with you as to how you've made the decision, why you've made the decision. And so that learning was acute, to say the least, but brilliant. I mean, a brilliant training ground for sure. And you learn very quickly in those environments that actually the stakeholder environment, the elements that sit around it, are as important as anything. It's not as simple as there is a message and we'll put it into the ether and it will be received in the way I want it to. Preaching to the converted, obviously. That's the bit that fascinates me.
And do you think? I mean, and certainly what I would say about the BOA is that the way it serves its national federations, having now seen other. From the National Federation point of view, do you think that helped you in terms of understanding the pressures that were on national federations when you moved into the BOA role, I guess, really? Yeah.
I think so, Scott. And I think with your experience at British Cycling, you'll recognise this. The one thing I do recognise is that, and I always talk about governing bodies, and that word governing just changes everything, right? That changes the definition of what you are there to do. governing bodies have almost, they've got the hardest task because you're trying to sell a brand and develop a brand and be entrepreneurial and commercial and market. But the word governing, is the drag anchor, right? Because you've got to do the hard stuff. You've got to take responsibility for getting the structures of the sport right, for safeguarding, for, generating that grassroots interest, for growing participation. So what I did recognise going into the BOA is actually delivering a team to the Olympic Games is probably a tenth or a fifth, a best of what a governing body is there to do. So that there are teams within governing bodies that have a really narrow focus on that. Now, it's our be all and end all. That's all we think about is, are we taking the team to an Olympic Games? But, someone at the FA, yes, there are people at the FA, and I'll use that as the example because I was working there thinking about taking the team to the Olympic Games. But the majority of them are thinking about, well, how are we getting a 6-year-old onto a football pitch at the first opportunity in Cumbria, right, in a safe way and being trained properly, and how they're going to grow a lifelong love of the game and enjoy it, and how that's going to, feed on, and how do we then get them into coaching and everything that comes with it, and then you're running competitions and events. It's, the bandwidth. I have great respect and appreciation for the bandwidth that national governing bodies have to have on a daily basis, because it's certainly not for the faint-hearted.
I think the complexity, and you highlight there the political and the stakeholder complexity of a governing body, is often not widely understood and appreciated. It's interesting the difference you talk about between, I suppose, being in a club, being an organization, and being in a governing body. But how do you, with the Olympics, get that common purpose so none of the pulls of different partners is, as you put, hindering what you're there for, which is high performance?
I think, I think whoever pulled this off back in the 90s and creating the Team GB brand did me great service in latter years, because I think what the BOA did, which a lot of teams have tried to do, is they managed to create a brand that sat away from the entity. So we don't really talk in terms of the BOA, and we're very deliberate in that sense. We don't talk to the audience about the BOA at all. If you go on our social channels, you won't see any institutional announcements. You may see, very, very unusually, if it's a CEO appointment or a chair appointment, of which we've got one soon coming up, you may see that, but you don't see the day-to-day bureaucracy of the organisation played out. We kind of laser focused on the audience, and that notion that I talked about earlier about just connecting the athletes to the audience. I think there's a great simplicity to the Team GB brand, which is built upon the athletes. It's built upon the public's love and affection for people going about their work really, really well and achieving extraordinary sort of feats. Our brand essence is everyday extraordinary, everyday people achieving extraordinary things. And I think it's really neat in that it just focuses you back on the fact that the athletes' stories are the brand, and it's about them in their communities. And again, I make this point, there could be small communities of people in smaller sports. It could be where they define where they're from, and we all, everybody remembers the goalpost boxes from London, because it grounded these great stories and these athletes back in communities firsthand, and the great pride that people drive from having athletes that they know or live nearby or come from where I'm from or train in the same place that I used to train at when I was a kid. That for me is the simplicity of it. I think the fact that we're not a governing body allows us to do that a little bit more easily than perhaps England and the FA, or the RFU in England and the ECB in England. I keep talking about England. Scott's going to have, I'm going to say the SFA in Scotland, right?
Well done, thank you.
Let's widen the scope a little bit here, but that for me is the simplicity of the place I work. And I think the TGB brand allows us to do that. We have to be really thoughtful about how we communicate still, and what we use our channels for, and how we do that. We by no means cracked it, but
I think then taking all of that, Scott, you've described very well how you sort of go from games to games, and so next around the corner you've got Milan for the Winter Olympics, and then LA for 2028. You'll be thinking now, I guess, about what things will look like in
Yeah.
LA. What do you think are going to be the big differences between here and there in terms of the media landscape?
Yeah, it's a really good one, and you're sort of doing a lot of pondering here, not least because you've got the lessons of Paris fresh in your mind,
Yeah,
and you're going, okay, well, we definitely won't do that again, but we definitely will do this again, and we'll do more of it. I think what we saw and what we keep talking about internally, and I think this is good fun, and I think it's going to be great, is that it's going to be an influence and celebrity games, right? Everyone, you always want to put a moniker on the games, don't you? And I think people were trying to say Paris was the TikTok games, and I think for us it was TikTok and Instagram for sure. I think, looking ahead for LA, influencer, celebrity, we saw the effect of Snoop Dogg's arrival in Paris for NBC, and everyone just saw, this is brilliant, this is great fun. I think we're going to see a lot at the LA Games. They will, to a greater or lesser extent, reinvent what the Olympics looks like, I think, and how we consume the Olympics. It's going to be a great Olympic Games. It's going to be a fun Olympic Games, and I think that layer of celebrity and influencer feels like to us it's going to be, right at the heart of it.
How does you talked about you've worked across different continents? How does that time difference and that cultural difference affect the way that you're communicating or a British audience sees the games?
It's a great question. And well, first off, I mean, in terms of sort of physically working the games, I'd much rather have a games with a time difference and the UK goes to bed for a
Okay.
period, just for personal reasons, because you get to eat something and have a bit of respite. And I was sort of naive in my enthusiasm for Paris being on our own time zone this summer, without realizing that it just meant that we were on the whole time. You went to bed and it was still full on. You woke up, it was still full on. We think really, really carefully about the way audiences consume content and how they consume content across different time zones. We didn't see people engaging with our highlights as much in Paris as we did for Tokyo, because self-evidently people were missing stuff through the night and having to catch up when they woke up in the morning, because a great deal of people did, but a great deal of people didn't want to wake up at 2 a.m. to watch Adam Peaty win his gold. I mean, they don't know what they're missing as far as I'm concerned. So the consumption of media definitely is the biggest focus. In that sense, we think a lot like a broadcaster, and we're having to think increasingly like broadcasters do. Is how are we going to tell the story? That's the biggest impact for us. And when will people want to consume that story, and how will they want to consume that story? And of course, that changes every cycle because platforms change, become more prominent. There are different drivers in that sense. And then it's the type of content, so it's fascinating. I've been talking to some of the broadcasters this week about how they're approaching the Winter Games in Milan Cortina. Because it's on our own time zone again, is there really the necessity for big highlights programs later on in the day, because people will have consumed a lot through the day, and or through their digital platforms, they'll just be dipping in to see stuff. So, things are changing in that sense. I think that's where the thought is going for us now, very, very much in terms of how we set about creating a sort of cadence and rhythm of content that suits the need of the audience based on what they will have seen or consumed through legacy and traditional media in the time that they're awake.
You've spoken very effectively, Scott, about how football is almost a 365 day of the year intensity all the way through the time. And then the contrast with that is you have the sudden leap of intensity at an Olympic Games. And I think unless you've been at the Games, it's very hard to describe what that's like from a media point of view. So I wonder if you could do that, describe what it's like, and then talk about how you manage that in terms of retaining the focus, your objectives, and then also, I guess, making sure that you come out of it and not fall over the finish line, basically, for yourself personally. Yeah.
I don't know whether I can give you any advice on the last bit. I think we all do fall over the finish line ultimately, but to a greater or lesser extent. I mean, yeah, I mean, it's for me, it's like cramming in 365 days worth of football into 17 days. I mean, for context, it's 40 concurrent world championships. So the intensity is there. We're a small organization, but we second lots of people in, so we're not without support. Of course, the mechanisms are there. What I do know is all the world's media are there and all the world's stories are there. I mean, we global stories exist at the Olympic Games. So talking about, athletes, transgender issues in sport, there's things that are alive in, politics, right? Elections in the US, as we see here now, that people have been talking about. So real live issues manifest themselves at the Olympic Games. We set ourselves up very much to think about making sure that we take as much noise away from the team as we possibly can. So really a lot of that comes into the structure of how I set the team up, the role I fulfill versus the traditional legacy media in terms of taking, incoming into the press office. We run an office setup at the games. I mean, there are thousands of accredited media at an Olympic Games from all over the world. So I make myself something of a target, a sitting duck in the office in the main press center at the Olympics. I absorb those questions on a daily basis, but we're very open about that. It's an open door policy. I want to have a great dialogue with the traditional media because I want to help make sure they're as well informed as they can be. I want to help shape the narrative as we go along. And so I set myself up in that way and set part of the team up in that way to deal with incoming. And we deal with it in a proactive fashion, right? We don't know what's coming through the door, but we set up and ready for that. And I think that then really strategically gives everyone else that oxygen to breathe that I've spoken about. I want sports press officers to be really focused on their athletes, on their events in the moment. Now, of course, we'll have a dialogue about issues that exist and we'll roll into support where we can manage issues. But otherwise, we're what we're really trying to do is manage issues and stories over here to allow the sport to carry on, just to focus on the output. And then we also have a what we call a managing victory program, which is where we've got a very purposeful and strategic approach to managing athletes' stories when they enjoy success or have prominent stories. And that is us then taking athletes on a media tour effectively over 24 hours, 36 hours. Can be very intense, but it allows some shape and format to the way they conduct their media activities after they've won a medal, as opposed to them or their press officers who are still in competition a lot of the time with athletes. This whole thing just carries on day after day after day after day. Just allows us to bring some shape to help them tell their story in probably the most coordinated fashion we can and give them a great platform to elevate their story.
Can I ask, you have to look after, sorry, Scott, you have to look after so many people and so many people's interests. But from a personal perspective, if I may, how do you, in the intensity of an event, keep a perspective of the wider world rather than inside the bubble? And how do you look after your personal resilience? What do you do to keep yourself sane, fit, and active in that kind of environment day after day?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I think for those of us who work on frontline comms and have done, or particularly in crisis areas, it's attritional. It's not always good work. You're not dealing with happy subjects all of the time. And you don't always get the outcome that you would like all of the time or is ideal all of the time. So resilience is something that you have to think about a lot. Clearly you learn through experience how to be more resilient. I'm very lucky that I work in an organization that's very grown up and thoughtful about this. We have lots of support mechanisms. I've just done a debrief session, even in the last 2 weeks, with our psychologists about the games. And much of it is just playing it back out. It's just talking to people and knowing that you can talk to people. It's super important. It's super important because you've got to be fresh every day. You've got to be you've got to be ready for what comes next, because there is always something coming next. So we put a lot of thought into that. we try and get the structures as sort of fleshed out as we can. We haven't got inordinate amounts of money to spend on staffing and personnel, but we need to make sure there's enough capacity in the system to support people through that really critical period. The mental health and well-being is a huge challenge, I think, not least for PR professionals who are sat on platforms like X all day, every day as well, having to expose themselves to the news, which is not always good, and to that environment, which is not always positive. So making sure you've got those outlets and to be able to have conversations. I'm very lucky to work in a very supportive organisation that has those mechanisms in place.
Yeah, I think having that resilience is important. And also, I guess, celebrating successes where you have them, Scott. How do you measure success for the business and for yourself professionally, and then for your partners?
I think there are a number of measures of successes. We do quite an in-depth athlete survey after the games. I think athlete satisfaction is clearly a really, really important element, and listening to what works for them and what doesn't. And look, we get things wrong along the way, unsurprisingly, and things change, and we need to learn. So athlete satisfaction is huge. Clearly, we're looking at all of our brand metrics all of the time, and the brand metrics tell us we come out of the games in a good place. Across our digital channels, engagement, audience growth is up year on year, and we had a relatively successful games in those terms. And also, we're a commercial organisation, so the bottom line gives us a readout on how well we've done or not. We've just come out of a successful 4-year period building up to Paris, and we start again for LA. So they're very public measures in that sense. The health of the organisation is very much predicated on the work that we do in the comms and the marketing team. So multiple success factors there, and then clearly again satisfaction of our commercial partners along the way is super important for us, and just ensuring that we're really maximizing opportunities for them. But we do, again, we're in an environment where we can be quite reflective, and we take our time to learn those lessons. We are still just even now finalizing the debrief process from Paris. So it's been a really in-depth 2 or 3 months where everything's out on the table, and we're able to discuss at length, what's worked well for us and what we need to change.
Great. Are there any particular comms metrics you look at? And your role is digital and all forms of communication. And I often say in sport, in a world where it's easy to measure medals and money, it's hard to measure some of the things about influence and the impact that communicators can have. Are there any metrics you look at or your organisation looks at for that?
I think partly because I've got the marketing role as well, it's the brand health metrics that I find really important from my point of view. What is the perception of the brand? What is the awareness level of the brand, and through different demographics, right? Not just mass populace. And the brand is in good health. One of the probably the metric that we're most proud of, that we measure most regularly, is what of the entities in this great country makes you proud to be British? And Team GB, for the first time, we've just drawn level with the NHS, which we've never managed before. We've always sat just in behind the NHS, which is fine by me, by the way. Absolutely fine. No one's arguing against the NHS. For sure. And we've always just sat ahead of the armed forces, actually, and they peak particularly around remembrance time of year as we sort of speak around now. But actually, we've drawn level with the NHS in terms of what makes people proud to be British. It's a wonderful metric for the brand, if nothing else. But those are the sort of metrics that we're looking at on a regular basis, just to ensure that, from a comms point of view, we're doing the right thing. We're protecting the brand and we're telling the stories well. I go back to the fact that I think that's particularly apt for comms, because our brand is built on athlete stories. It's built on our ability to translate those fantastic stories of those athletes, their resilience, the hard times that, and the graft that they've gone through over a 4-year period, often without reward, but building up to that pinnacle moment at the Olympics.
You have a particular favorite moment or something that really shows the power of storytelling around the Olympics? Is there something that special to you?
It's not so much a favourite moment, and you always sort of advise not to have favourite children in this environment necessarily. But do you know what? I use as a case study the weightlifter Emily Campbell, who I think, and I say this really advisedly, but in many respects, some people might say she's got quite a normal story, right? Just, there's nothing that spectacular about it, but she tells her story so compellingly well. She's won medals at 2 consecutive games now in a sport that has very few people around it, not much infrastructure, not much resource. She takes her story and tells it so engagingly well to any audience that will listen. And she talks in a really inspiring way about getting women and girls to lift weights and to not be afraid to lift weights, but to talk about that perception. She talks about body image. She talks about weight, things that otherwise people aren't talking about. But actually, at the center of it all is just someone going about her job in quite a normal fashion, really, really well. She's winning medals, but she's got a lovely personality, lovely persona. And I think she always comes to life. She comes to life when she tells her story. And whilst that's not a moment in itself, I just think she's a great case study for anyone who wants to look at personal PR, particularly around athletes, of someone who's taken the responsibility herself to do that. I'm not taking any credit for any part of Emily's story. She's done it all herself, right? But she's just taken the time about thinking about what it is that she wants to tell people, what her message is, and the community that she wants to talk to. And she's worked with us to create opportunities to do that throughout. And, and I think she does it. She's a great credit to her sport. She's a credit to herself. She's a credit to Team GB. And I think she sort of sits at the center of that ethos of everyday extraordinary for me.
And I think you're absolutely right. I think if you were going to show any athlete from any sport how to conduct themselves, that right there is a great example, right? Yeah.
Yes, and she dealt in Tokyo. She dealt with Laurel Hubbard was lifting weights in Tokyo. It was a transgender weightlifter in the games for the first time. Emily was having to answer those really, really difficult questions, right? Really tough questions, highly personalized questions as well, to someone that she knew and respected and liked. And she navigated that so well by being human. First and foremost. It's a great quality. It's a great quality. It's also a great lesson in why we shouldn't always overtrain people in media.
Yes.
Because she's 100% natural. And I think we've tried to keep it that way throughout. If she wants to ask us questions, we're there to answer them. That's my thought. But we're not there to make her something she isn't or something she doesn't want to be.
So I've just got one last question, Scott. That's where I get to do my Kirsty Young impression. So if you could go back to speak to the Scott Field, who at the point he stopped being a journalist and became a communications professional, what's the one piece of advice that you'd give your younger self?
Yeah, well, I wasn't much of a journalist, so I didn't have to think about that part too. It's a great question. There are tons of things that spring to mind for me, tons of things. And I've been really lucky to work with great people. I think one of the bits of advice, this isn't a bit of advice, but one of them is, work with people you want to work with good people, not always just look for the place you want to work with people that are going to inspire you, are going to be good to work with. But I think the thing I did alight on in the end was just trust yourself. You're going to be okay at this. We all, I think to greater or lesser extent, I'm sure, go through periods of imposter syndrome, still have it now. Am I good at this? Am I doing the right thing? Can I do it? And that's the bit clearly when you're in your early career as well, you probably think most, isn't it? And you probably have a perception of how people need to be and how you act. And look, I was very conscious of my accent and where I was from in those early years and things like that, and that wasn't from the home counties and stuff, and it's like, does any of that matter? No, it doesn't actually. And I think, that notion of trusting yourself, trusting your instinct, that you'll be okay through this. And also knowing that in doing so, nobody around you knows everything. Nobody's got all the answers. We're all searching for them on a daily basis, right? So, trust the fact that you're going to be okay at this.
I think that's great advice, especially, I mean, we are more and more data led in communications, but fundamentally, the big decisions are often just judgment calls. They're 60-40, they're 70-30 at best sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, and some of that comes through knowledge and experience. The one thing I would add to that is I think relationships are critical still. You know, for all that we present ourselves through digital platforms and use digital media and different means of communication, the fundamental of being able to form a relationship, create a relationship, and leverage a relationship at the right time, it is still, you know, can swing a 60-40 or can swing a 50-50 for sure, one way or the other. And also, no, I think as communication professionals, you need to understand people to know how to get to people, right? You know, audiences have emotions, right? They are us. And you know, you can sort of think of it all as this one sort of, you know, nebulous blob, if you like. But actually, I think, you know, you need to understand relationships really fundamentally and enjoy right fostering relationships. And
Yeah.
I'm sure we all do, right? Enjoy fostering relationships to get the most out of this world and this industry for me.
Really struck there by suppose the purpose at the core of the organization and what you're there for and knowing what it's there for. Secondly,
Yeah.
the way you talk about the power of relationships, including relationship with yourself and trusting yourself. I think the third is that you're there to support athletes and help them to tell their stories. I couldn't agree more with the need to help and coach people to tell the story they want to tell
Yes.
and not
Yeah.
over polishing, over training. There's such great stories come through everything around the Olympics and the athletes. And finally, actually, around your point around good people. And it sounds like you're in a good organization that knows how to support people and how it knows how to help them to do their job in the best way. So I've really enjoyed that conversation. I think I can say that for the other Scott too.
Thank
Um,
you.
and I just want to say thank you for taking that time and
Thank you.
explaining those things so well, giving us so many great insights. So thanks very much for that.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed it. It's great to have been offered the chance to do this. And yeah, if anyone who's listening to this wants to chat anytime about anything, then I'm always up for the chat around comms and media issues for sure.
And we are going to invite you back because we're going to ask you to listen in to future events and the ones coming up. So
Great.
hopefully you'll join others in going to the CIPR Sports Group on LinkedIn to follow for more details, see when those events are coming up. And it's an invitation to anyone, if they're not a member of the CIPR, go to the website and please sign up. But Scott and other Scott, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.